This waste the story of how I almost died as a young kid home alone and possibly the most intense night of my life with way too much going on. We're a family of 5. I was 10 at the time, my older brother was 14, and my little sister was 5. It was a Friday night. My brother was out with his friends causing trouble, clearly because a dreaded phone call came to my parents. All I remember was that I was in my room playing a Star Wars video game when I heard my mom start freaking out and crying. I got really scared and hurried to see what was wrong. My mom was on the phone with a hospital calling to inform my parents that my brother had gotten hit by a car. Obviously, we were all shaken and really scared. My brother's leg was broken, but I don't know what else was said on the phone. All I know is that my parents hurried to get their coats, grabbed my little sister from her room and asked me if I was okay to stay home alone. I said yes, and they hurried out to the car and left. I was, of course, really worried for my brother, but I really didn't want to go to the hospital and see him in any kind of bad condition. I don't think my parents wanted me or my sister to either, but they didn't want to leave my 5-year-old sister home without them. It's worth mentioning that my brother recovered just fine. Ash's injury is no longer relevant to the story, other than it being the reason why I was left home alone on a Friday night before my dad left, who was trying to calm down my mom, telling her that my brother was going to be okay. Seeing my dad like that made me feel better. I had a feeling my mom was just being overdramatic like any mom would be. I continued playing the Star Wars game for a couple more hours when I heard the front door open. I had my bedroom door closed by this point. It was easily past midnight and my bedtime, so it turned off the TV and PlayStation and crawled into my bed with my Game Boy. It tried listening to hear my parents' voices, maybe hear if my brother was with them, or just hear what they were saying, but I didn't hear anything after a few minutes of nothing even come up the stairs. I had a feeling something was wrong. I walked to my door and opened it quietly, then proceeded to walk over to the ledge and banister, which overlooked my living room. The lights were off, but there were 3 tall people standing in my living room. They weren't my family. I was so petrified that I was frozen for a second before I could quietly walk back into my room and shut the door as quietly as I could in my trepidation, but it wasn't quite enough, and I knew they had to have heard the door click shut. Just slightly. I hurried to my closed door, opened it quietly, stepped inside, then shut the door. I had myself sitting behind a bunch of boxes and bags of clothes that were stuffed in my clothes. I was actually pretty covered from view. My first thought was it might be a lost night. People occasionally wandered into these woods and turned. I called out, "They do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even move. It just stood the reshadow backdrop of the tree. No face, no features, just a tall dark shape. My chest tightened. Not to react, maybe they were scared or confused. "Max, let's go," as Ed tugging gently on his leash. He hesitated, but eventually followed me as I started Ed walking back toward home. That's when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Not walking exactly, but almost staying just at the edge of the tree line every time I stopped. It stopped when I started walking again. It followed it right to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe the way the shadows moved with the wind. My hand started to shake and Max growled again, a deep rumbling sound I'd ever heard from him before. By the time we reached my street, I was practically jogging, my breath clouding in the cold air. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the figure never left the trees. It just stood there watching. When I got to my house, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers clumsy from the cold, and I panicked. Finally, I got the door open, and Max and I rushed inside. I locked the door, double-checked it, and turned off all the lights. I stood there in the dark, my haunting, listening. The house was silent, except for the sound of Max's heavy breathing. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whoever or whatever it was had stayed in the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched at around 2 a.m. I woke up to a sound outside my window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else whispering. It was faint, almost like the wind was carrying voices, but it was too clear to deliberate. My stomach turned as I crept to the window and peeked out through the blinds. What eyes made my blood run cold. The same figure was standing just outside my yard, its head tilted slightly, as if it were listening, and it wasn't alone. It looked like it was talking to someone, but there was noon. They're just the figure standing in the faint glow of the streetlight, its shadow stretching across the grass. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice is shaking as I told them someone was outside my house. They told me to stay on the line and that officers were on their way. It felt like forever, but the police arrived quickly. I watched from my window as their patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. 2 officers got out and approached the figure. They called out to it, their voices firm but calm. The figure Didn't run or resist it, just stood the reese they cuffed it, and with the tyranny of the officers knocked on my door. To let me know they had the man in custody, I asked if they knew who he was or why he was there. That the officer hesitated for, saying it's strange he's been missing for years. Would think he's been living in the woods all this time. He's not talking, though. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing with questions. Why had he been following me? Or what had he been talking to the officer? Assured me that they would take him in and figure out what was going on. But his words didn't do much to calm me that night. I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept thinking about the way the figure had moved, the way it had followed me without ever stepping into the light. And those whispers, I still don't know if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me the next morning. I found myself staring out the window, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. It wasn't, but that didn't bring much comfort even now. I don't take Max in late night walks anymore. I can't bring myself to gone Arthur Woods, the police. Never told me much about the man they arrested, but I heard from a neighbor that he was taken to a psychiatric hospital. Sometimes I wonder if he was just a man who'd lost this way, or if there was something darker in those woods that had found him first before we jet into the next story. If you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share this as stories with your friends and family. Thanks. In 2023, I lived in a tough part of New York City. The streets were noisy during the day, but unsettlingly quiet at night. I worked the late shift at a small office downtown, finishing around 11 p.m. Most nights it wasn't the safest routine, but it paid my rent. One cold November evening, I was heading to work. The underground parking lot where I kept my car was dimly lit and nearly empty. As usual, I parked near the entrance and grabbed my bag, ready to start my shift. As I walked toward the elevator, something caught my eye. A man stood near a car a few rows away. At first, I thought that might be unlocking his car, but his movements seemed strange, as low and deliberate, like he was trying to pry the door open. I paused for a moment, unsure if I should say something or keep walking. Before I could decide, the man looked up and saw me. His face was shadowed under the dim light, but I could feel his gaze. He didn't move at first, just stood there staring. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit. His steps were quick but steady, like he didn't want to draw attention. I felt a storm of unease, but told myself to focus on work. The rest of my shift was uneventful. I typed reports, answered emails, and tried to forget about the men in the parking lot. By the time I finished, I was ready to head home and get some rest. When I returned to the parking lot, it was even quieter than before. My footsteps echoed as I approached my car. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, maybe that man, but the lot was empty. I unlocked my car and got unlocking the doors. Something about the silence felt heavier than usual, but it told myself it was just my imagination. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, eager to get home. The drive home was uneventful. At first, the streets were mostly empty, and the soft thum of my car filled the quiet. The highway stretched ahead, bordered by dark trees that seemed to press closer the further I went. About 10 minutes, and I thought I heard a faint noise behind me. It was soft, like the rustle of fabric or a small shift in weight. My heart skipped, but I brushed it off. The car is just settling, I muttered to myself, keeping my eyes on the road. But then I heard it again, this time louder, a distinct sound like someone moving. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't just the car. I glanced at the rear view mirror, and my blood ran cold. In the shadows of the back seat was the man from the parking lot. Was sitting there, his eyes fixed on me, his face blank, but tens of my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what to do. Should I stop the car, speed up? My mind raced, but before I could make a decision, he spoke. Keep driving, he said calmly, but there was an edge to his voice that made my stomach turn. I obeyed, my thoughts spinning. How had he gotten into me car? Had he been there the whole time? Pull over by the trees, she ordered, motioning to a dark, isolated spot on the side of the road. Is wallowed hard and died ashes at hoping he would just take what he wanted and leave. Once the car stopped, he pulled out a gun, wallet, phone. He demanded. His voice is still unnervingly calm. I handed the mover without hesitation, my hands shaking. I didn't say anything else, just stared at me for a moment before opening the door and stepping out. Before disappearing into the trees, she turned back and said, "If you call the cops, I'll find you." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I sat there for what felt like hours, my breathing shallow and my heart pounding. Finally, I managed to start the car and drive to the nearest gas station. The bright lights felt like a sanctuary after the darkness of the highway inside. I told the cashier what had happened and asked to use the phone. He handed it over, word, his eyes wide with concern. The police arrived quickly, and I recounted everything. The man in the parking lot, how he must have hidden in my cart. The robbery. They searched the area, unearthed the trees, but found no sign of him. "You're lucky he didn't hurt you," one officer said, his tone serious. I nodded, still shaken. The drive home that night was one of the longest of my life. Every shadow on the road seemed to move, and every sound made me jump. When I finally got home, I double-checked every lock. On my doors and windows, still feeling like Hem might somehow show up again for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started checking my cart thoroughly every time I got, and even in broad daylight, the thought of someone hiding so close without me knowing haunted me. I never saw the man again, but the fear stayed with me. It wasn't just about the robbery, it was about how easily he had slipped into my life, how close he had been without me realizing it. That kind of fear doesn't go away, it lingers like a shadow in the corner of your mind, reminding you that some dangers are closer than you think. I was 14 when it happened. My mom worked long shifts as a nurse of 10 overnight, and my brother was at college. That left me alone in the house most weekends. At the time, it felt normal, just another part of growing up. But that night taught me how vulnerable I was. It was a Saturday, and I'd invited Molly over. She was someone I'd been talking to a little more than a friend, though we hadn't put a label on. It was spent the evening watching movies in my room, laughing and joking around. My bedroom was upstairs with a window overlooking the backyard deck. Mall. PM. Because her parents didn't like her staying out too late, we hugged goodbye, and then I was alone again. I stayed in my room scrolling through my phone and half watching TV. The soft glow of the screen was comforting in the quiet house. At some point, I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the wooden deck below my window. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was deliberate, loud enough to make me freeze, curious. I got up and looked out the window. A man was sitting in one of the deck chairs, his body silhouetted in the dim light from the neighbor's porch. My first thought was that Molly had come back for some reason, though it didn't make sense. As still I called her name softly through the window. The figure looked up at me. It wasn't Molly. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, his face partially obscured by shadows. But I could tell he was staring right at me. His gaze felt invasive, like it pinned me in place. I ducked back behind the curtain, my heart pounding, grabbing my phone. I texted a few friends in our group chat asking if any of them were pulling some kind of sick prank. Their replies came quickly, confused denials and jokes about me watching too many horror movies. I didn't believe it was them. None of my friends would come to me house just to scare. But they weren't that kind of people, but that only made things worse because it meant this man was a stranger. My stomach churned with fear. But curiosity got the better of me. I crept back to the window and peeked out. He was still there, sitting in the chair, staring at my window. It was dark, but I could see enough to know he wasn't moving. His presence felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something. I swallowed the lump in my throat and tried to sound brave as I called down to him. "What do you want?" At first, they didn't respond. Then his shoulders started shaking. It took me a moment to realize he was laughing, silent, wheezing laughter that sent shivers down my spine. The sound finally broke through, faint and breathy, like the wind whistling through cracks in a door. "Please go away," I shouted, trying to sound commanding, but my voice cracked, betraying my fear. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, his head tilted at an odd angle, as though mocking me. Islam met the window shut, and drew the curtains. My hands trembling, my mind raced. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? That a man was sitting in backyard staring at me? It sounded ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. I retreated to my bed, curling into a ball with my arms wrapped around my knees. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the TV, which I hadn't turned off. I didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. The house was so quiet that every creak and groan of the old wood seemed deafening. Just when I started to convince myself that he was gone, I heard it, the sound of the back door handle being jiggled. My blood ran cold. He was trying to get inside. I bolted out of bed and crouched at the top of the stairs, straining to hearth. The door rattled again, harder this time, followed by a faint thud, like he was testing the strength of the lock. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I pressed my hand over my mouth before making a sound. Then it stopped for a moment. I thought they'd given up, but their relief was short-lived. I heard him move around the side of the house, the crunch of gravel underfoot. My heart pounded as I realized he was heading for the front door. The sound of the doorknob twisting reached my ears, followed by a soft push against the door. Thankfully, the lock shelled. Tears stung my eyes as I scrambled back to my room and locked the door. I grabbed my phone, finally working up the courage to call someone, anyone, but my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the call button for 911. The front door creaked, then fell silent. I waited, ears straining for any sound. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eventually, the house was quiet again. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed huddled in my bed, clutching my phone like a lifeline. When my mom finally came home around 900 in the morning, I broke down and told her everything. She was furious that I hadn't called the police. Looking back, I know she was right, but at the time I'd been paralyzed by fear. The man never came back. We never found out who he was or what he wanted. My whole adult life, I have been a police officer. I've been working the 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift in Fairfax County, Reston, Virginia, for as long as I can remember. It wasn't the career I dreamed of after high school, but it paid the bills over the years. The job grew on me, especially because of the friendships I built with my colleagues. It was a regular day, this past September, sunny but not too hot, around 10 a.m. A call came through at the station. A mental health professional requested a welfare check on a 33-year-old woman named Sydney Wilson. According to the report, she had been in an agitated state of mind and her behavior was a concern. I decided to take the call. Welfare checks are usually straightforward, knocking on the door, making sure everything is okay, and leaving once you confirm the person is safe. I drove to her apartment complex, a small building tucked away on a quiet street. The place looked like any other in the area, modest but well kept. When I got to the door, I knocked firmly and called out, "Police department, is anyone home?" After a few seconds, the door creaked open. About halfway, a woman stood in the doorway here, yes, darting around like she was looking for something or someone. Him started, "I'm Officer Lou, I'm here to check on." Before I could finish, she mumbled something I couldn't make out, slammed the door shut and locked it. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to make of her behavior. Was she scared, agitated? I wasn't sure, but it didn't feel right. I knocked again, louder this time, but there was no response. I kept knocking every 20 seconds or so, hoping she'd come back. After about 2 minutes, the door opened. Again, she stepped out slowly, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "How are you?" she asked abruptly, her tone oddly cheerful. I barely had time to process the question before she swung a knife at me. The blade slashed across my forehead and the pain me instantly, stumbling backward. It tried to create some distance between us. My hand went to my head and I felt warm blood trickling down. She stood there, gripping the knife tightly, mumbling words I couldn't understand. I drew my gun, holding it steady. As I shouted, "Drop the knife." Back up. She didn't move away. Instead, she stepped closer, a grip on the knife tightening. I backed up further, trying to keep my voice firm. "Drop the knife. I'm warning you." But my words didn't seem to reach her. She lunged at me again, slashing the knife across my face twice more. The stinging pain blurred my vision for a moment, but my training kicked in, fearing for my life. I fired 2 shots, both missed, hitting the wall behind her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she grabbed at me, her movements erratic and frantic. I fired again, 3 more shots this time. All 3 struck her in the upper body. She stumbled back, dropped the knife, and collapsed onto the floor. I immediately called for backup. "Shots fired, suspect down, requesting medical assistance," I said into my radio, giving my location as clearly as I could. My hands were slick with blood, and I could feel it dripping down my face. Thankfully, it wasn't rapid, which meant the wounds weren't life-threatening. Within minutes, other officers arrived at the scene. Paramedics were close behind. They rushed me to the hospital, while another team tended to Sydney as I sat in the ambulance. The adrenaline started to wear off, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I had shot someone. I had killed someone. At the hospital, doctors treated my wounds. Several stitches for the deep cuts on my face and forehead. They assured me I would recover fully. Still, the emotional weight of the incident was harder to shake. I had never fired my weapon in the line of duty before, let alone taken a life later. I learned that Sydney had been pronounced dead at the hospital. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I replayed the events in my mind over and over, questioning if I could have done something differently. But every time the conclusion was the same: she had left me no choice. It was her me for her days after the incident. I couldn't sleep well. I'd wake up shaking, haunted by the memory of her lung with the knife. My colleagues were supportive, reminding me that I had acted in self-defense. Even so, it's one thing to know that logically and another to feel it emotionally. I had to undergo the usual procedures after a shooting: interviews, internal reviews, and counseling sessions. Each step was a reminder of what had happened, but it also helped me process everything. The department ultimately ruled the shooting justified, but the experiences stayed with me. I used to work as a caretaker for an old small church in a quiet town. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it had its peaceful moments. The church had been standing for over 100 years, and it looked just like you'd imagine a church in a small town to look: tall and weathered, with a bell tower that rang at odd times and a cemetery right next to it. I would go there almost every day, cleaning and taking care of things. I knew the building inside and out, but there was something about it that always made me feel uneasy. One afternoon, I was alone at the church. As usual, the sun was setting, casting long shadow on the ground. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the trees near the cemetery started to sway back and forth, making soft creaking noises. It was strange. There was a kind of silence around the place that felt different from other times. The air felt thick, as if something was just about to happen. I was finishing up my work when I heard a faint sound coming from inside the church. It wasn't a normal sound. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old building, but something else, like a soft whispering at first. It thought it was just the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls, but the longer it stood, still the clearer it became. It sounded like voices, low and hurried, almost like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. It was. Then that I noticed something else through the small window at the top of the church, where I could see out toward the cemetery. I saw a figure. It was a small figure standing by the gate of the cemetery near the old iron door that led out to the road. The figure was so small, it could only have been a child, but it was so still, and there was something wrong about the way it stood there in the fading light. I could barely felt my heart race, my breath coming faster. I couldn't take my eyes off her. I wanted to go outside and check, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The girl didn't move. She just stood there staring ahead, her tiny body barely visible in the shadows. I watched her for what felt like hours, but when I finally gathered the courage to go outside, she was gone. I walked over to the door of the church, my mind racing with confusion. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been working too hard and the strangest sound had tricked me, but when I stepped outside, the cemetery was empty. There was no sign of the girl. I didn't know what to think. I went back inside the church and tried to shake off the feeling of unease. But the whispers I had heard before were still there. The voices had grown louder, now filling the space and bouncing off the walls. They seemed to come from everywhere at once. Close, far away, high, low. It was like the church was alive, breathing with voices I couldn't understand. I stepped back and stared at the altar. The flickering candlelight cast strange shadows on the walls, stretching and twisting in odd shapes, and then at the corner of my eyes, I witted. There was the figure, the small girl standing in the corner, near the old wooden pews, but this time she was moving slowly, very slowly. She walked toward me. I froze, me feet planted on the floor. As she got closer, her face was pale, and her eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. Her mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. She wasn't smiling, but her expression was empty, blank, as though she wasn't really there. My heart beat faster, and I felt my body tense. What was happening? Who could even move? She stopped in front of me and pointed toward the cemetery. Her finger was trembling, and her eyes never left mine. I didn't know what she wanted. I didn't know what to do. All I could do was stare back at her, then just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. I looked around in panic, but the church was empty again, the only sound being the wind outside. My body was shaking, and I could feel the sweat running down my back. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I ran out of the church, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I went straight to the cemetery, searching for any sign of the little girl. But there was nothing, no footprints, no sign of anyone. It was as if she had never been there at all. I stayed outside for a long time watching the cemetery, but there was nothing to see. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. Something about the cemetery, the church, and the girl didn't sit right with me. I'm 30 years old and I share a house with my sister. It's a 2-floor setup, any of those mother-daughter houses with separate kitchens. My sister has the downstairs apartment and I take the upstairs. She's not home much though, since she often stays over at her boyfriend's place about 20 miles away. I like to think I'm not someone who gets easily spooked, but sometimes being home alone in this big house unsettles me more than I'd care to admit. This particular night, I was home alone, lounging on my couch, engrossed in a horror movie. My portion of the house is an open-concept space, like the living room, kitchen, and dining area. All blend. The couch sits smack in the middle, meaning my back is to a large open room. Whenever I'm watching TV, the only light came from the TV's eerie glow. It made the shadows in the corners of the rooms email of every shift, and I'd glance over my shoulder, just a habit. It told myself something about the open space, always made me feel like I wasn't entirely all one, but I chalked it up to the movie. It was one of those psychological thrillers that gets under your skin. After the movie ended, I brushed my teeth, turned off all the lights, and went to bed. I fell asleep quickly, but woke up around 1 a.m. to the sound of my sister's voice. At first, I thought I dreamed it. The voice wasn't muffled like it would have been if she were outside. It sounded like she was inside the house. It startled me awake. My sister's voice carried a distinct tone. It wasn't just calling out, it sounded frantic, almost angry, still groggy. As I up and listened, why is she yelling? I muttered to myself. My first thought was that maybe she and her boyfriend had an argument, and she'd come home upset. I shuffled out of bed and into the dark hallway, flipping on the light. As I walked toward the staircase, I heard her again. She was calling my name louder, this time from downstairs. What is it? I called back, my voice cutting through the stillness. She didn't answer, but the tone of her yelling unsettled me. It wasn't just urgent, it sounded off, descending the stairs. I felt around for the light switch in the foyer. I couldn't find it. The darkness seemed thicker down here, and my half-asleep brain wasn't helping. Where's the damn switch? I said, fumbling along The wall, her voice came again this time. It was louder and clearer. "Come here," she yelled. It was coming from her kitchen. My stomach dropped. Something about her tune felt wrong, like it wasn't entirely hers. I found the kitchen light switch and flipped it on. The fluorescent light flickered to life, starting to demand, then brightening. The light illuminated the entire downstairs apartment, the living room, kitchen, and part of her hallway. It was empty. "Hello," I called out, stepping further into the space. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums. My pulse quickened as I walked toward her bedroom. Her door was ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The room was empty. Her bed was neatly made, her nightstand undisturbed. There was no sign that she'd come home at all. "Jasmine." I called out again, my voice wavering. Still no answer. As I turned to leave the room, I heard a loud thud. My heart jumped into my throat. The sound came from her room, the same room I had just checked, which was completely empty. It froze my breath. Catching my instincts screamed at me to get out, but curiosity or stupidity kept me rooted. Slowly I stepped back into her room. The light from the hallways pilled in, casting faint shadows on the walls. I scanned the floor, expecting to see something that had fallen over. Nothing was out of place. The bed was undisturbed, the furniture exactly as it had been a moment ago. I backed out of the room, heart pounding, and hurried upstairs to my bedroom. Slamming the door shut, I locked it and glocked it. Phone me hands were trembling as I dialed Jasmine's number. The phone rang, but she didn't pick up. It tried again and again, no answer. Eased on my bed, staring at the locked door, every creak of the house, sending my imagination into overdrive. Was I losing my mind? Had I hallucinated all of this? I couldn't shake the vividness of her voice or the unsettling urgency in her tone. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streamed through my window. The terror of the night felt distant, like a bad dream, until I check. My phone. Jasmine had texted me, "Why did you call me at OM? Is everything okay?" Mr. Mac twisted. I quickly replied, "Were you home last night? I thought I heard you downstairs." Her response came almost immediately, "No, I stayed at Matt's." I went downstairs to her apartment in the daylight, determined to make sense of what had happened. Her room was exactly as I'd left it, undisturbed. The kitchen and living room showed no signs of anyone having been there. But as it turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the floor near her bedroom door was a faint scuff mark. It hadn't been there the night before. And then I noticed something else. The air downstairs carried a faint acid smell, something metallic like rust or blood. I bolted upstairs, locked myself in my room, and spent the rest of the day convincing myself that I had imagined everything. The gas station was quiet, almost too quiet always. Was during November nights. The cold seeped in through every crack and crevice. No matter how high we turned the heat outside, frost covered the pumps like a thin layer of silver paint. My breath came out in thick puffs. Even indoors, the heater groaned in the back office, struggling against the freezing air. I had taken the night shift because I needed the money. Nunos wanted it, and the pay was a little better. But sometimes I wondered if it was worth it. Between the cold, the isolation, and the kinds of people who rolled through at midnight, it felt more like punishment than a paycheck. The gas stations at on the edge of town, fair enough from the main road, that wouldn't get many customers that night. I hadn't seen a single person in over an hour. I was perched behind the counter, scrolling through my phone to stay awake. The glow of the screen was comforting in a way, like a small beacon of normalcy in the otherwise empty void. My fingers were freezing, even with gloves on. The small space heater under the counter barely helped. Then I heard it. The bell over the door jingled. I glanced up, expecting to see a regular one of the truckers or late night travelers who sometimes stopped in. Instead, and stepped inside. His face hidden by a heavy hood. He was bundled in a thick jacket, the kind you'd wear if you were planning to spend hours in the cold evening. My voice is steady but polite. The man didn't answer. He walked toward the back of the store, his boots squeaking faintly on the tiled floor. Something about him felt off. It wasn't just the way he ignored. There was tension in his movements, like he was trying too hard to appear casual. A rugged off people came through here in all kinds of moods. Some were tired, some were grumpy, and some were just plain weird. I went back to my phone but kept them in my peripheral vision, healing urged by the snacks, picking up a bag of chips and putting it back. Then doing the same with a candy bar. Minutes passed. He hadn't come to the counter. I tried to focus on something else, tapping at my phone screen as if scrolling through apps could drown out the strange vibe in the room. That's when the door jingled again. More men walked in, both dressed like the first hoods up faces shadowed. They didn't say a word, went to the drink cooler. The other loitered by the magazines. My heart rate picked up. 3 men all dressed alike, all acting weird. Maybe it was nothing. It told myself maybe they were just traveling together still. Couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The first man finally came to the counter, placing a pack of gum down in front of me. I forced a smile and rang it up. "That'll be 99 CZ. He didn't move to pay. Instead, He stared at me, his resting flat on the counter, his hood cast shadows over his face, but I could see his eyes. They were cold and calculating behind him. The other two men had stopped pretending to browse as they stood by the door, blocking it. My stomach dropped. Look, man. The first guy said, his voice low and deliberate. Let's make this simple. Open the register. It froze. Me brain stuttered, trying to process his words. Open it. They repeated, sharper this time. I nodded, my hands trembling, as I punched in the code. Town locked the register. The drawers lit open with a mechanical clink, revealing a pathetic amount of cash, maybe $70. Tootle, the man reached over and grabbed the bills, stuffing them into his pocket. Now the safe. I hesitated. I don't have the code for the safe. Only the manager does. He leaned closer, his breath visible in the cold air between us. Don't lie to me. I'm not lying, he stammered. It's true, the safe's on a timer. I can't open it then if I wanted to. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought that was going to reach across the counter and grab me behind him. One of the other men muttered something. The first guy straightened up, scowling. Fine, he said, but if you call the cops, we'll know. They turned and left, the door jingling mockingly behind them. I stood there staring at the empty doorway, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The room felt colder than ever for I didn't move. My brain kept replaying the scene over and over like it couldn't let go. The fact that it had happened. Eventually, I forced myself to lock the door and call the police. My hands shook so badly that I almost dropped the phone. The cops arrived about 20 minutes later, long after the men were gone. I gave my statement, describing them as best as I could, but honestly, I doubted they'd be caught. They hadn't left behind any evidence, and the SEC security cameras were old and blurry. When the officers left, the gas station felt emptier than ever. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I finished my shift, somehow, though I don't remember much of it. My mind was stuck on the men's faces, or what little I'd seen of them. The way their eyes had been so motionless, like they weren't even human. The manager didn't blame me for what happened. He said I'd done the right